Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The Aldermere Arms. I'm not someone who scares easily. I want that established before anything else, because everything I'm about to describe happened to a person who spent 8 years living and working inside the building it happened in, who wasn't looking for anything strange, and who spent most of that time telling himself there was a boring explanation for all of it. I don't believe that anymore. I'm not asking you to believe me either. I'm asking you to hear it in the order I lived it, because the order is most of what convinced me. I've told fragments of this to a small handful of people over the years since. A partner who eventually stopped asking why I check my own locks twice every night. A coworker at a later job who caught me once mid-thought and never brought it up again after seeing my face. But I've never once told the whole thing straight through, start to finish, in order. I'm doing that now because enough time has passed that I think I can get through it without the reaction I used to have. And because after everything, I think it deserves to exist somewhere outside my own head, told properly, the way I actually lived through it rather than the shorthand version I've given to few people who've asked directly. The Aldermere Arms is a 6-story pre-war apartment building, 41 units, brick and terracotta trim, the kind of building that still has a working dumbwaiter shaft nobody uses and radiators that clank like conversation every October when the heat comes back on. It sits mid-block on a quiet residential street, unremarkable from the outside except to anyone who happens to look closely at the stonework above the entrance, where the building's original construction year is carved into the lintel along with a motto in Latin that none of the tenants I ever asked could translate, and that I never got around to looking up myself, in 8 years of walking under it nearly every day. I took the live-in superintendent job there in my late 20s, mostly for the free basement apartment that came with it, and I stayed 8 years because I genuinely liked the work, fixing what broke, knowing every tenant by name, being the person people trusted to have a spare key when they locked themselves out at 2 in the morning. I want that on the record too, the same way I want the fear on the record. I loved that building for most of the time I lived in it, more than I have ever quite managed to love anywhere I've lived or worked since. There were 41 units on paper. Only 40 were ever rented in the 8 years I worked there. Apartment 4B, at the end of the 4th-floor hallway, past the service elevator, was permanently listed by the management company as under renovation, had been for as long as anyone currently living in the building could remember, longer than my own 8 years by a wide margin, and, as I'd eventually learn, longer than that phrase could plausibly have described anything real. I asked about it during my very first week, mostly out of practical curiosity, since part of my job was knowing every unit's condition for insurance and maintenance purposes. A binder I was handed on day one that listed square footage, fixture ages, and last renovation dates for every unit in the building except that one, where the relevant field simply read, "Not applicable, see property manager." My property manager, a woman named Denise Marsh who oversaw 4 buildings for the ownership group and visited the Aldermere maybe twice a month, told me flatly that 4B had structural issues from an old renovation that never got finished properly, that it wasn't safe to rent, and that my job with respect to that unit was simple. Keep it locked, don't let anyone in, and don't worry about it. That was a real, sensible-sounding answer. Old buildings have units that fall out of the rentable stock for boring structural reasons constantly. I didn't think about it again for the better part of a year. The daily rhythm of that job is worth describing, because it matters later how completely ordinary that rhythm had become to me by the time anything strange started happening. I'd start most mornings walking the building floor by floor, checking the boiler, checking for leaks, fielding whatever maintenance requests had come in overnight. I knew which stair treads creaked, which tenants kept odd hours, which mailboxes stuck in humid weather. I had dinner most Thursdays with Ray Delgado, who supered a sister building 2 blocks over for the same management company, a heavy-set, calm, endlessly patient man 15 years further into this line of work than I was, who trained me during my first month and who I trusted more than almost anyone else in the city by the end of my first year. I got to know Eleanor Voss, a widow in her 80s who'd lived in 4C, directly across the hall from 4B, for over 40 years, since before the current management company even owned the building, and who I checked in on personally at least once a week the way you do with an elderly tenant who has no family listed on her emergency contact form. And I got to know Priya Chandrasekharan, a tenant in her late 20s who moved into 4D, 2 doors down from 4B, in my 4th year, and who became, without either of us intending it, one of the people who ended up carrying part of this story alongside me. I should say something about why a person takes a job like that in the first place, because it matters for understanding how long I let myself stay even after things turned strange. I liked being needed in a specific, tangible way, a leaking pipe fixed, a lock rekeyed, a nervous new tenant reassured that the building's odd creaks at night were just an old building settling. There's a particular satisfaction to being the person who quietly keeps a building running, invisible until something breaks, and I built a real identity around that over 8 years. I mention this because I think it explains how slowly I let myself believe anything was actually wrong. A person who's found the specific version of usefulness that finally fits doesn't want to be the kind of person who gets spooked out of it by a noise in an empty hallway. I'd chosen a life organized entirely around being the calm, reliable presence other people relied on, and I think, looking back, I held on to that self-image longer than the evidence probably justified, in more or less the same way Ray and Eleanor, and even Denise were each privately holding onto some version of the same thing, each of us weighing how much unease we were willing to sit with in exchange for a building and a routine we'd otherwise built our lives around. Year 1. My first year, I noticed one small thing near 4B that I filed away without much thought, the way you file away most oddities in your first year at any new job. The lock on 4B's door, an old, heavy deadbolt I'd been given a key to on my first day specifically so I could check on the structural issues periodically, per Denise's instructions, though I never once actually did that check that first year, occasionally felt, when I passed it during my floor walks, faintly warm to the touch, on days when the rest of that hallway ran the same cool temperature as every other hallway in the building, and on days when no sunlight could have reasonably reached that stretch of wall at all, given the building's own north-facing orientation on that side. I chalked it up to sunlight angle through the stairwell window, or a heating pipe running unusually close to that particular wall, and mentioned it to nobody, because it genuinely didn't seem worth mentioning. I remember, once, resting my whole palm flat against it for a few seconds longer than necessary, telling myself I was simply confirming a maintenance detail and feeling something closer to a pulse than a temperature, faint and slow, and almost certainly, I told myself at the time, just my own heartbeat carrying through my hand. Year 2. My second year, in early spring, I noticed my own master ring of building keys, which I kept, without exception, hanging on a specific hook just inside my basement apartment's door, the same hook every night for the entire first year I'd lived there, had gone missing one morning. I searched my apartment for 20 minutes, assuming I'd simply misremembered where I'd left them, checking pockets and counters and the floor beneath furniture, before finding them eventually sitting on my kitchen counter, centered almost precisely in the middle of it, a room I was entirely certain I hadn't carried them into the night before, let alone set down with that kind of deliberate placement. I remember standing there turning the ring over in my hands, running through every mundane explanation. I'd been tired, I'd done it half asleep, and simply not remembered, and settling on that explanation because it was the only one that didn't require anything unusual to be true. I want to note now, because it matters later, that the 4B key was on that ring, on the same loop as every other master key, and that I checked, that morning, whether it was warm. It wasn't. I didn't think to check again for years. Year 3. My third season passed almost entirely without incident, save for one thing I only understood as significant much later. Part of my job involved logging every maintenance request and every noise complaint that came through the building's tenant portal, a spreadsheet I kept meticulously because it was genuinely useful for spotting patterns. A unit with recurring plumbing issues, a floor with a pest problem, a stretch of piping that failed every winter without fail. Going back through 3 years of that spreadsheet once, out of idle curiosity rather than any real suspicion, I noticed that noise complaints logged as originating from the 4th floor were, almost without exception, described by the complaining tenant as coming from the end of the hall or near 4B specifically, rather than from any of the 3 actually occupied 4th floor units. A pattern I hadn't consciously registered while I was simply responding to complaints one at a time as they came in, each one logged and closed without ever being cross-referenced against the others. I noted this to myself as probably just proximity bias in how people describe hallway sound, a plausible enough explanation, and didn't think much more of it. There was a second thing from that 3rd year, smaller, that I only connected to the rest of it much later. The building's original 1920s call button intercom panel, long since replaced by the digital system, but never physically removed from the lobby wall, sitting decommissioned beside its modern replacement as a piece of architectural charm the ownership group liked to point out to prospective tenants, had a row of brass buzzer buttons, one per unit, each still wired in a way our electrician had assured me was inert. Twice that year, arriving for my morning building walk, I found the 4B button on that dead panel pressed inward and holding, the way a button stays depressed only if something is actively holding weight against it, though nothing was, both times, when I checked. I mentioned it to our electrician the second time, who told me old brass buttons can seize in a depressed position from corrosion alone, no current required, and that it likely meant nothing beyond age. I accepted that explanation at the time. I've thought about it considerably since. Year 4. It was in my 4th year that things started in earnest, and it started the way I think these things always start, which is with something too small to matter, immediately followed by something considerably harder to explain away. I was doing a late building check one evening, walking the 4th floor around 11 at night after a tenant had called about a flickering hallway light, and as I passed 4B's door I heard, unmistakably, 3 sharp, deliberate knocks coming from the inside of the apartment, not the building settling, not a pipe, but the specific, unmistakable rhythm of someone rapping their knuckles against the inside of a door they wanted opened. I stood absolutely still in that hallway for a long moment, keys in hand, telling myself it had to be an animal, a pigeon that had somehow gotten into the supposedly sealed-off unit through a broken window, something with a mundane explanation. I didn't open the door that night. I told myself I'd check in daylight, with Ray there for a second pair of hands, and I went back to my apartment and didn't sleep especially well. The second time it happened, 4 nights later, at almost exactly the same time, the knocking came again, same 3 sharp raps, and this time, without fully deciding to, I found myself answering it, knocking back against the outside of the door, twice, the way you'd acknowledge a person on the other side. There was a pause, maybe 5 full seconds, and then the knock came a third time from inside, slower now, almost deliberate in a way the first 2 instances hadn't been, as if whatever had made the first sound was now responding specifically to the fact that I'd answered it. I didn't knock back again. I went downstairs and didn't sleep at all that night. There was a third occurrence, roughly 10 days after the second, that I've never told anyone the full detail of until now. I was doing my normal late walk, and rather than passing 4B's door at a steady pace the way I usually did, some impulse made me stop directly in front of it and simply listen, my ear not quite touching the wood, but close enough to feel its cold radiating against my face. For nearly a full minute, nothing. Then, from somewhere inside, unmistakably, the specific creak of old floorboards under slow, deliberate weight, crossing the room from what I judged to be the far wall toward the door itself, footstep by footstep, each one closer than the last, until the sound stopped directly on the other side of the door, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the exact spot the weight had settled behind. I did not knock that time. I stepped back, slowly, and walked the rest of my route at something closer to a jog than a walk, and I changed my late check route that same week to avoid passing that door after dark entirely, a change in my own routine I never once explained to Denise in any maintenance log. By the third week after that, the knocking hadn't repeated, and I told myself that settled it. Some structural settling, some acoustic trick of an old building's ductwork, a coincidence that had simply happened to sound rhythmic more than once. I went back to treating 4B the way I always had, a locked door at the end of a hallway that wasn't my problem to think about, though my rerouted late check path stayed rerouted. When Ray and I had dinner that week, sharing the beer and takeout routine we'd built over years, I asked him, half joking, whether any of the units in his building had ever had a reputation for being off, in a way nobody could fully explain. He didn't laugh. He went quiet for a second, turning his bottle in his hands, and then he told me that in his own building, 2 blocks over, there was a similar unit, not permanently vacant the way 4B was, but one that management had quietly stopped assigning to new tenants without formally taking it off the rental roll, simply routing around it in the leasing paperwork whenever a prospective tenant asked to see it. He said he'd never had anything as specific as knocking, but that he'd worked that building for over a decade and had developed, without ever being able to fully explain it to himself, a habit of never being the last person to leave that particular hallway after dark. You don't need a reason for a habit like that, is how he put it. You just notice you've got one. I want to be honest that at the time, I filed this under 2 building supers half convincing each other of something over beers, and mostly let it go. I finished my 4th year without further incident, I noticed. I finished my 5th year the same way, quiet, mostly uneventful, though there were 2 smaller things that 5th year that I only later understood as part of the same pattern. The first was that I started, somewhere in the back half of that 5th year, unconsciously changing my building check route to pass 4B earlier in the evening rather than later, without ever quite admitting to myself why. The second was smaller still, easy to miss. Twice that year, I found the building's decades-old brass mail slots, each one individually labeled with a unit number and, on the older ones, an engraved tenant name from whenever the plate had last been updated, with 4B's slot, which had no current tenant name on it at all, containing a single piece of mail. Not addressed to resident or current occupant, the way mis-delivered mail usually is. Addressed, in both cases, to a name I didn't recognize from any lease record I had access to, a Mr. A. Whitfield. I checked our tenant history going back as far as the building's digital records extended, roughly 15 years, and no Whitfield had ever lived at the Aldermere in that entire span. Both envelopes, when I finally worked up the nerve to check the postmarks properly, were stamped from a post office 2 neighborhoods over that our current mail carrier confirmed, when I asked her directly, had been decommissioned and folded into a larger regional facility over 30 years earlier, meaning the postmark itself shouldn't have been possible to produce on current equipment at all. A detail the carrier found genuinely funny until I told her where the envelopes had turned up. I mentioned it to nobody else, filed both pieces of mail in a drawer, and told myself it was simply a postal routing error, a name from some previous decade's mailing list still circulating somewhere in the system. I believe that less now than I did then. There was one more thing from that 5th year worth mentioning specifically, though at the time I connected it to nothing beyond idle curiosity. The building's intercom and buzzer system had been upgraded 2 years earlier to a digital panel with a small motion-triggered camera above the main entrance, mostly so tenants could see who was buzzing from their phones. That system kept a rolling log of every triggered event. Going through it once for an unrelated maintenance reason, I noticed the panel had recorded 4 separate triggers over that year timestamped between 2 and 4 in the morning, each one showing 10 seconds of the empty lobby with absolutely nothing in frame. No person, no delivery, nothing that should have tripped a motion sensor calibrated for something roughly human-sized moving through that space. I mentioned it to the building's IT contractor, who said, plausibly enough, that cheap motion sensors in older digital panels sometimes false trigger from electrical interference in old wiring, especially in a building with the Aldermere's original 1920s electrical infrastructure still partially in place behind the walls. I believed it, mostly, the way you believe explanations that let you keep doing your job without dwelling on it. I pulled up one of those triggered clips myself, months later, more out of a nagging need to look than any real expectation of finding anything. 9 seconds of the lobby, empty and still, the way the IT contractor had described. In the final frame before the recording cut off, so brief I watched it a dozen times before I trusted what I'd seen, the lobby's brass mail slot panel, the same wall of individually labeled boxes that included 4 Bs, showed what looked, for a single frame, like a shadow falling across it from a direction the lobby's actual lighting couldn't have produced, gone again by the next frame. I never mentioned that specific detail to the IT contractor. I'm not sure what I expected him to tell me that would have helped. It was partway through my 6th year, the one that ended the job for me entirely, that I stopped being able to explain any of it away. Early that year, in March, I finally did what I should have done years earlier and unlocked 4B myself in full daylight, mid-morning, with Ray there beside me at my request, both of us telling each other it was overdue basic due diligence rather than anything more than that. The apartment inside was exactly what I expected in one sense and nothing like it in another. The layout matched every other 4-line unit in the building. Same footprint, same pre-war moldings, the same tall windows facing the street that every other 4th-floor tenant complained about for letting in too much afternoon light. But it was completely, eerily intact in a way a genuinely structurally condemned unit never would be. No exposed beams, no water damage, no sign of any renovation ever having been started at all. Furniture from what looked, to my untrained eye, like decades earlier sat under a uniform layer of dust, a settee upholstered in a faded floral pattern, a roll-top desk with its cubbies still stuffed with yellowed paper, a freestanding radio cabinet nearly as tall as I was, its dial still set to a station number that hadn't existed on any modern radio band in decades, arranged as if someone had simply stepped out and never come back, rather than as if a unit had been gutted for renovation and abandoned mid-project the way Denise's explanation implied. I want to describe one specific thing I noticed that morning, because it's the detail I keep returning to. The apartment was completely silent in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. No street noise bleeding through the windows, no building hum, a stillness with an edge to it that I could feel the boundary of as we stepped through the doorway, the way you can feel the edge of a cold spot in an otherwise warm room. Ray felt it too. Neither of us said anything about it out loud that day, though he told me later, much later, that it was the specific reason he'd never once offered to come back with me on his own. On the roll-top desk, I found a single framed photograph, faded nearly to sepia, of a man in early 20th century dress standing in front of what was unmistakably the Aldermere's own front entrance, unchanged in its stonework across the intervening decades. On the back, in fountain pen, someone had written a name and a year. Aldous Whitfield, 1931. I went back into 4B one more time before that 6th year was out, alone this time. In early June, on a pretext I gave myself of needing to photograph the unit's condition for an insurance file that didn't actually require any such thing. I told myself, walking up, that it was simple professional thoroughness. Looking back, I think some part of me had already stopped fully believing that. The apartment felt different alone than it had with Ray beside me. The same edged stillness, but somehow more attentive to my presence in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't stood there themselves. I photographed the main room quickly, hands steadier than I expected, and then, on an impulse I still can't fully account for, I opened the bedroom closet, which neither Ray nor I had thought to check on our first visit. Inside, alongside several decades-old coats still hanging with an unsettling ordinariness, the closet's rear wall bore a series of shallow marks scratched into the old plaster at roughly shoulder height. Not random scoring, but a repeated pattern of short parallel lines grouped in clusters of 5, the kind of marking a person might use to count days with no calendar to hand. I counted past 30 clusters before I made myself stop counting. Below the last full cluster, cut deeper and more deliberately into the plaster than anything above it, was a single word, still. I don't know what it meant, or who carved it, or how long it had been there before I found it. I closed that closet door faster than I've closed anything in my life, and I did not photograph it, and I never mentioned that specific detail to Ray or to Eleanor, though I told Priya, much later, after everything that happened to her, and she went very quiet and didn't ask me to describe it again, which told me more than any question would have. I mentioned the Whitfield name to Eleanor Voss the next time I checked in on her, treating it as a piece of building history trivia rather than anything more pointed, and she didn't dismiss it the way I half expected her to. She told me, in fact, that she'd heard the name exactly once before, decades earlier, from the building's superintendent at the time she'd first moved in, a man long since retired and, as far as she knew, long since passed, who'd told her, in what she'd taken at the time for an old man's colorful exaggeration, that 4B had belonged to a bachelor named Whitfield who'd lived there alone through the 1930s, kept almost entirely to himself, and had simply stopped being seen by anyone in the building sometime in the winter of 1938. No move recorded. No forwarding address. The apartment, according to what she'd been told, had simply been locked up by the building's owners at the time and never rented again, through every subsequent change of ownership since, each new management company apparently inheriting the same unspoken instruction along with the building's deed: leave 4B alone. About 3 weeks after that conversation, I woke in my own basement apartment at roughly 1 in the morning to the sound of my own name, spoken clearly from somewhere in the apartment beyond my bedroom doorway. Not shouted, not urgent, just spoken once, flatly, in a register that carried none of the natural rise and fall a real voice has when it's genuinely trying to get your attention. I lay still, telling myself it was hypnagogic, an auditory hallucination at the edge of sleep, a well-documented and harmless phenomenon. Then it said my name a second time, from a different part of the apartment than the first, not closer, just relocated, the way a voice moves if you imagine someone walking a slow, silent circuit through your own home while you lie there unable to make yourself get up and check. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I found nothing out of place in my apartment, nothing missing, no sign of entry, the deadbolt still thrown exactly as I'd left it. What I did find, sitting on my kitchen counter in the exact spot my keys had turned up on their own years earlier, was a single piece of mail addressed to A. Whitfield, though I kept no such mail anywhere in my own apartment. Both pieces I'd found over the years had gone straight into a drawer in the building's basement office, not my private residence. A drawer I checked immediately and found undisturbed. Both original envelopes still exactly where I'd filed them. 2 nights after that, I woke to find every framed photograph in my own living room turned face down against the wall, each one lowered with enough apparent care that none of the glass had cracked, an arrangement I absolutely had not left them in the night before. I remember standing in my living room in the gray, early light, turning each frame back around one at a time, and thinking, very clearly, that whatever had done this had wanted me to understand it could move through my own space as easily as it apparently moved through the buildings, and that the locked door between us had never meant anything at all. I told Ray about the name-calling at our next dinner. He didn't look surprised, which bothered me more than if he had. He told me it was the second account like that he'd personally heard connected to that specific apartment, his own vague sense of unease near it for years, and one more specific story. A former tenant of 4D, 2 units down, who'd moved out abruptly years before either of us had taken our jobs, citing in her exit interview with the previous superintendent, according to notes Ray had once seen in an old paper file. Someone calling my name from an apartment that's supposed to be empty, and refusing to elaborate further before breaking her lease early. I told him about the photographs that time. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, simply, "Nothing's ever come into my apartment." That's new. I didn't find that reassuring at all. That was the same dinner where Ray told me, for the first time, about a superintendent 2 supers before him at his own building, a man he'd never met, only heard about from an old maintenance ledger he'd inherited, who'd apparently kept a private log of his own, similar to the one I hadn't yet admitted to keeping myself, tucked inside a false-bottom drawer in the building's basement office. Ray said he'd found it by accident years earlier, read perhaps a third of it before deciding he didn't want to know the rest, and had put it back exactly where he'd found it rather than either finishing it or throwing it away. He'd never told anyone that detail until that night, he said, mostly because there had never before been anyone else in his life who wouldn't have simply told him he was imagining things. I decided, finally, after 6 years of avoiding it, to ask Eleanor Voss for everything she actually knew, in full rather than in fragments. I sat with her in her apartment on a Sunday afternoon, tea going cold between us on her small table, the wall we shared with be close enough on my left that I found myself unable to stop glancing at it every few minutes without meaning to. When I brought up Whitfield's name directly this time, her whole manner changed. She set down her teacup carefully, folded her hands, and told me she'd thought about this a great deal over more than 40 years in that building and had simply never before had anyone she felt was worth telling the whole of it to. She told me that, according to what she'd been told by that same long-retired superintendent, Aldous Whitfield hadn't left the Aldermere willingly. He'd been, by every account she'd ever heard, a difficult, reclusive man, resented by more than one previous building owner for refusing every attempt to buy out his lease during a 1930s renovation push that modernized most of the rest of the building around him. He alone had held out, refusing to vacate 4B under any terms, for reasons nobody outside his own head had ever fully understood. And then, in the deep winter of 1938, he had simply stopped being seen, all at once, with no formal move recorded and no next of kin ever coming forward to claim the unit or its contents. The building's ownership at the time, rather than clearing out and re-renting the unit the way any landlord normally would with an abandoned lease, had instead quietly locked it. And this was the part Eleanor said quietest of all. Every subsequent owner, across nearly 90 years, and by her count at least 6 changes of management company, had inherited the same unwritten instruction without exception, for B stays locked. And nobody asks why past the first time they're told. There was a second version of the story, Eleanor told me, one she'd heard only once, from a woman 2 decades her senior, who'd briefly lived in the building during Eleanor's own first year there and who had since passed away. In that version, Whitfield hadn't vanished all at once in a single winter. He'd been seen, increasingly rarely and increasingly changed, for nearly 2 more years after 1938, glimpsed by other tenants late at night on the stairs or in the lobby, saying nothing, looking, in the words this woman had used and which Eleanor had never forgotten, less like himself each time, before finally not being seen again at all sometime around 1940. Eleanor said she didn't know which version was true, if either fully was, and that she'd stopped trying to reconcile the two a long time ago, because both versions arrived at the same locked door regardless of how they got there. She told me one more thing before I left that afternoon, delivered the way you delivered genuinely useful, practical advice rather than a story meant to unsettle me. If I ever heard my name called from inside that apartment, I should not answer it, and I should not go inside alone under any circumstance, because in her understanding, built from 40 years of living 12 feet from that door, Whitfield hadn't so much left that apartment as stopped being separate from it, and whatever called out from in there now wasn't calling because it wanted to be found. It was calling, she said, because it wanted someone to open that door from the outside. I spent part of my next scheduled day off doing something I probably should have done years earlier and went down to the city's property records office, telling myself I simply wanted to verify the building's ownership history for my own curiosity. The clerk pulled the relevant deed books for me without much comment until I specified the exact unit, at which point she paused, looked at me a beat longer than the request seemed to warrant, and told me, in the careful, neutral tone of someone who has learned exactly how much to say to strangers, that Unit 4B's individual records were thinner than most for that building, and that I shouldn't be surprised if I didn't find everything I was hoping for. She was right. The building's overall deed history was clean and complete across every change of ownership since the 1920s. But 4B specifically appeared, starting in 1938, in an unusual separate ledger the city apparently kept for units under some kind of indefinite legal hold, condemned properties, contested estates, units tied up in litigation, listed simply as occupancy suspended, owner of record deceased, or unlocatable, a designation that had, as far as the clerk could tell from the records in front of her, never once been formally lifted or reviewed in the nearly 90 years since. I asked her whether that kind of open-ended hold was unusual. She said records from that era were often left administratively incomplete for all kinds of ordinary bureaucratic reasons, and that she wouldn't read too much into it. She said this, I noticed, without once looking up from the desk. Before I left, I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether she'd ever come across a hold like that before in all her years working those archives. She looked at me for a long moment, the particular look of someone weighing how much a stranger is owed, and told me only that she had, twice, in buildings on opposite sides of the city, and that in both other cases, as in this one, the unit in question had eventually been permanently sealed rather than ever brought back into use, which she offered, she was careful to say, not as confirmation of anything in particular, only as a pattern she thought I should have. I also found, in the newspaper microfiche archive at the public library 2 blocks from the courthouse, a single brief item from February of 1938, for sentences long, reporting that a longtime resident of the Aldermere Arms, Mr. A. Whitfield, has not been seen by neighbors in several weeks. Building management reports his rent account remains current and undisturbed, with no follow-up article in any subsequent issue I could find, that year or the next. No obituary. No notice of estate settlement. No further mention of the man at all, in a paper that otherwise covered, in exhaustive local detail, things as minor as building association meetings and neighborhood social announcements. Whatever had happened to him, the city had apparently noticed just enough to print 4 sentences, and had then, permanently, stopped noticing at all. While I had the microfiche reel loaded, I searched further back as well, mostly out of the same restless curiosity that had gotten me that far in the first place, and found a much shorter item from 1929, a building association notice congratulating Mr. A. Whitfield of 4B on a decade of continuous residency at the Aldermere, meaning, if the arithmetic was right, that he'd already been living in that specific apartment since roughly 1919, close to the building's original construction, longer than any other tenant mentioned anywhere else in that decade's issues. I sat with that reel a long time after I found it, turning over the ordinary, cheerful language of a decade anniversary notice against everything Eleanor had told me, and I still don't know what to make of a man who apparently never once, in nearly 20 years by 1938, lived anywhere else in that building, or, as far as any record shows, anywhere else at all. That piece stayed with me the rest of that year, and it was what finally made me ask Denise Marsh directly, the next time she visited the building, whether she had her own reason for the structural issues, explanation beyond what she'd told me on my very first day. She was quiet for a long moment, longer than I'd ever known her to go quiet, before she told me that in her first year managing this specific building, over a decade before I'd started, she'd gone into 4B alone one afternoon to do exactly the kind of routine inspection I'd finally done with Ray, and had left within 2 minutes without finishing it, out of nothing more sophisticated than an overwhelming, wordless certainty that she needed to leave immediately and not look behind her on the way out. "I've managed 4 buildings for this company," she told me, in a tone I'd never once heard her use in 6 years of otherwise entirely businesslike conversations. "I've had units with mold, units with structural cracks you could put a hand through, one building where a boiler actually did explode. I've walked into all of it without a second thought. I walked out of that apartment backward, and I have never once been able to explain to myself why, and I have never gone back in." She said she had never gone back in again in all the years since, and had never asked any superintendent she'd hired to either, without ever writing down or fully articulating why in any file the company kept. "I told you it was structural," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The building's real too." "I never said it was the only reason." Priya, in 4D, told me something of her own around that same time, unprompted, sitting in her doorway one evening with a level of seriousness I hadn't seen from her before, a takeout container going cold on the floor beside her that she'd clearly stopped eating from partway through. She said that on more than one occasion over the past year, she'd had the distinct, physical sensation of being watched while walking past 4B's door on her way to the elevator, strong enough that she'd started, without consciously deciding to, walking the stairs instead specifically to avoid that stretch of hallway, even on days when she was carrying groceries and the stairs were genuinely inconvenient. She told me she was seriously considering breaking her lease early, something she said she'd never admitted to anyone else in the building, out of concern it would sound irrational. I told her, as honestly as I could manage without fully explaining why, that I didn't think it was irrational at all. About 10 days after that conversation, Priya knocked on my basement door at around midnight, visibly shaken in a way I'd never seen from her before. She was not, by nature, someone who spooked easily either, having lived alone in the city for the better part of a decade before moving into the Aldermere. She told me that she'd been falling asleep roughly 20 minutes earlier when she'd heard, distinctly, 3 slow knocks against her own bedroom wall, the shared wall between 4D and the vacant 4B, followed by a voice, muffled but unmistakably present, saying her name once, calmly, the way you'd say someone's name to wake them gently rather than urgently. She said she'd lain frozen for several minutes afterward, and that when she'd finally worked up the nerve to check her phone, she'd found a single new voicemail on it, time-stamped to almost exactly when she'd heard the knocking, from a blocked number, containing 11 seconds of what she described as just breathing, and then nothing. She played it for me on her phone that night. I heard it too. Neither of us ever fully agreed, afterward, on whether the breathing sounded like it was getting closer to the receiver or further away over those 11 seconds, and I've never been able to decide for myself since. That was the night I finally told her most of what I'd kept to myself for 2 years by that point. The knocking, the keys, the photographs, though I still held back the closet, unable to make myself say it out loud even then. She listened without interrupting, sitting on my kitchen counter with her knees pulled up, and when I finished she asked me, quietly, why I'd never told management, never insisted the unit be properly investigated, never simply refused to keep being the person responsible for a door like that. I didn't have a good answer for her. I told her the truth, which was that some part of me had, by then, started to feel almost protective of the building despite everything. The same way you stay loyal to a person who's hurt you because you remember who they were before. She didn't say anything for a while after that. Neither of us brought it up again until the week everything changed. Year 6. By that point in my 6th year, I'd stopped pretending to myself that any of this had a boring explanation waiting to be found. I'd started keeping a small notebook, separate from my official maintenance log, where I quietly recorded every odd thing connected to that hallway. Dates, times, exactly what I'd heard or found. I told no one about that notebook, not even Ray, and I couldn't fully explain to myself why I kept it beyond a growing sense that someday, somehow, a record of it might matter to someone besides me. I also, without ever officially logging it anywhere, started doing an extra late check specifically of the 4th floor hallway every night before bed, a habit that added maybe 10 minutes to my evening and that I told myself was simple diligence, even as some quieter part of me understood I was actually checking on Priya's door as much as 4B's. The building's last week of that 6th year is the one I still can't fully put back together in order, even now. It started with Priya failing to show up for a scheduled maintenance appointment in her own unit, which wasn't like her at all. She was, in every other respect, reliably punctual. When I knocked and got no answer, and her phone went straight to voicemail after several attempts, I let myself in with my master key out of genuine concern and found her apartment empty, her purse and phone still inside, her front door locked from the inside in a way that meant she hadn't simply stepped out for a walk without them. I called Ray, and then the police, in that order, and what followed was 2 days of a building-wide search that I still find difficult to describe fully. Officers went floor by floor, unit by unit, with tenant consent secured room by room, checking closets, checking behind furniture, checking the old dumbwaiter shaft, and every storage locker in the basement. The lead detective, a methodical man named Sorensen who'd clearly run building searches before, asked me early on for a full list of any unit in the building with unusual access history. A question I answered honestly, if incompletely, by mentioning 4B and its permanently locked status, without yet saying anything about knocking or names or any of the rest of it. He noted it, without much visible reaction, and moved on to the rest of his checklist. A K-9 unit was brought in on the 2nd day to help cover common areas the department couldn't easily search by hand: stairwells, the dumbwaiter shaft, the basement storage rooms. That dog, a German shepherd who'd clearly been thoroughly trained and worked confidently and efficiently through every other part of that building, including areas far more cluttered and difficult than the 4th floor hallway, refused, flatly and repeatedly, to approach within roughly 10 feet of 4B's door, sitting down hard at that exact distance no matter how her handler encouraged, coaxed, or eventually firmly commanded her forward. The handler, a woman who told me afterward she'd worked K-9 search and rescue for nearly a decade, said she'd never once seen that specific dog refuse a direct area command like that in her entire career, and that she wasn't going to force the issue against the dog's own clear signal. Ray, who'd come as soon as I called him and stayed through both full days of the search without once being asked to, pulled me aside during a break on that same morning, not long after the dog had refused the hallway, and asked me quietly whether I'd ever heard of anything like this happening in any other building in the neighborhood. Not just ours, not just his, but anywhere in the surrounding blocks of similarly aged pre-war stock. I told him I hadn't looked. He said that in his 15 years supering in this part of the city, he'd heard, secondhand and unverifiable, of at least 2 other buildings within walking distance that each had one unit longtime staff simply didn't discuss, in terms vague enough that he'd never been able to pin down anything concrete, and specific enough that he'd never quite been able to dismiss it either. He didn't offer a theory. He just wanted to know if I had one, and when I told him, honestly, that I didn't have anything I could prove, he nodded like that was the answer he'd expected and went back to helping the officers clear the next floor. I told Detective Sorensen everything I could about 4B at that point, in as measured and factual a way as I could manage, fully expecting to be politely dismissed as an over-involved building employee grasping at superstition under stress. I gave him, at that point, the private notebook I'd been keeping for over a year, dates and incidents laid out in my own handwriting, and told him he could do whatever he wanted with it. He read through it in front of me without comment, his expression giving away nothing, and then, to my visible surprise, given what the search dog had just done directly in front of him less than an hour earlier, he ordered the unit forced open that same afternoon for a full search, the first time, as far as I know, that door had been opened by force in the better part of 90 years. It took the responding officers close to 20 minutes to defeat the original deadbolt and a second, older mortise lock behind it that none of us had known was even there, buried under decades of paint. They found Priya inside, on the second afternoon of the search, sitting on the floor of the apartment's small bedroom with her back against the wall, physically unharmed but severely disoriented, dehydrated, and unable to account for nearly 36 hours of missing time, in an apartment she had absolutely no key to and, as far as anyone could determine, no way of having entered on her own. Her eyes, when the first officer reached her, were fixed on the apartment's closed closet door, the same closet, though none of the searching officers had any way of knowing this, whose rear wall I had photographed nothing of and closed as quickly as I could months earlier. It took nearly a full minute of the officer speaking directly to her before she seemed to register anyone else was in the room at all. I was allowed into the hallway, though not the unit itself, while paramedics assessed her, and I remember the specific sound of her voice when they finally walked her out past me on a gurney, still speaking in the flat, exhausted cadence of someone repeating something they'd already said many times to many people that day. She looked at me directly as they passed, and said, quietly, not quite a question, "It knew which door was yours too." I've never been able to decide, in all the time since, whether she meant that as a warning, an accusation, or simply the only true thing she had left to say to the person whose job it had technically been to keep that door locked. She kept saying, once she'd calmed enough to speak more fully at the hospital that evening, that she remembered hearing someone calling her name from inside her own apartment, gently, almost kindly, telling her something was wrong with her smoke detector and asking her to come check it, and that she remembered, after that, almost nothing at all until she woke up on the floor of a locked apartment she'd never once been inside. She also mentioned, unprompted, to a hospital counselor afterward, a vague memory of writing something down during those missing hours, though she couldn't say what or on what, a detail I only learned about because the responding detective mentioned it to me weeks later, off the record, after he'd found, in a search of the apartment's roll-top desk, a single sheet of blank paper with one word written on it in unfamiliar handwriting that wasn't Priya's own, still. Priya was released from the hospital 2 days later with nothing physically wrong beyond exhaustion and dehydration. She moved out of the Aldermere within the month, and as far as I know, she never gave a fuller account of those 36 hours to anyone, including, eventually, the police department's own closed case file, which listed the incident as unauthorized building access. Individual found disoriented, no criminal activity established, a real, official, defensible classification, and one I have never once fully believed, having been in that hallway myself when they finally opened that door. I helped her carry boxes down to a moving truck on her last day in the building, neither of us saying much of anything, and the last thing she said to me before she left was that she hoped I'd find a reason to leave too, before the building decided I'd been there long enough to matter to it. I gave my notice 2 weeks later. I told Denise, when she asked, that it was simply time for a change, which was true in the narrow, technical way. Surface explanations are always true without being the whole truth, and I took a job managing a much newer building across town the following month, a building with sealed, structurally sound floor-to-ceiling glass, and not one single unit that anybody working there bothered treating differently from any other. I remember walking out of the Aldermere for the last time with everything I owned in 2 suitcases, and I remember, without ever fully deciding to, not looking back down the 4th-floor hallway from the stairwell landing the way I normally would have, on my way out the front door for good. I stayed in touch with Ray for a couple of years after I left. About 2 years after, he told me the ownership group had finally, quietly had 4B's door bricked over entirely from the hallway side during an unrelated capital renovation. The unit itself simply absorbed into the building's official floor plan as non-existent square footage, its former door frame plastered flush with the rest of the wall. Following, he said carefully, a second incident he only described in vague terms, one that never made it into any tenant-facing communication, and that he genuinely didn't know the full details of himself, beyond the fact that it had been enough for ownership to finally, permanently seal the space rather than simply keep locking a door. He described the renovation crew to me in more detail than I expected, unprompted, the way people do when something stayed with them longer than they meant it to. For men, he said, all experienced, all the kind of contractors who'd worked in dozens of old buildings without incident and weren't the type to spook over a job site's ordinary strangeness. The framing and drywall work went normally the first day. On the second day, with the new wall roughly 2/3 closed, the crew's foreman told Ray, weeks later, and only after several beers, that all 4 of them had heard 3 slow knocks from somewhere inside the remaining gap, evenly spaced, patient in a way that unsettled him more than urgency would have. He said none of the 4 men discussed it with each other on site. He said they simply worked faster than the schedule required, finished sealing the last section before their normal end time, and each of them, independently, found some pretext not to be the one who swept up and locked the building that evening. I asked Ray, on that same call, whether he'd ever gone back inside for B himself after Priya was found, out of the same kind of curiosity that had eventually gotten the better of me with the courthouse records. He said he hadn't, and that he had no intention of ever starting. He told me one more thing before we hung up, something Denise had apparently mentioned to him in passing, off the record, sometime after the ceiling was finished, that the construction crew doing the brickwork had reported, independently, and to more than one of them, hearing 3 knocks from the other side of the wall partway through the job, and that the crew had simply finished the section faster than scheduled and left for the day without discussing it amongst themselves until much later. I still think about that building more often than I'd like to admit, even now, years removed from it. I still check that my own doors are locked twice before I sleep, a habit I picked up somewhere in that 6th year and have never once let go of since, even in buildings I know have never given anyone a single reason to feel uneasy. I still, in any building I've worked in since, find myself quietly noting which unit, if any, nobody else on staff wants to talk about, and I have never once, in the years since, ignored that instinct when I found one. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a person who's carried something like this for years without saying it out loud. It isn't fear, exactly, not most days. It's closer to a permanent, low-grade attentiveness, the sense that the ordinary world has one fewer clean edge in it than you used to believe it had, and that you've simply learned to live alongside that missing edge the way you'd live alongside a scar. I don't wake up thinking about the Aldermere most mornings. But I have never once, since leaving that job, fallen fully and easily back into the version of myself who assumed every knock on a wall had an explanation waiting to be found, if you just thought about it clearly enough. I've worked in 3 buildings since, and in each one, within the first month, I've found myself quietly cataloging which corner of the building the staff don't talk about, half expecting to find nothing, half relieved every single time when I don't. Every so often, usually late at night, usually when I can't sleep for some unrelated reason, I find myself running the whole thing back in order. The warm lock, the keys on the counter, the mail addressed to a name that shouldn't exist, the pressed brass button, the marks in the closet, the courthouse ledger with its 90-year gap, Denise walking backward out of a room she'd otherwise have walked into without a second thought, the dog that wouldn't cross 10 feet of hallway, the word written in handwriting that wasn't Priya's, found on a desk in an apartment she had no way of entering, and I try, every time, to find the one detail that breaks the pattern, the one piece that would let all of it collapse back into coincidence, and old building noise, and an overactive imagination. I have never once found it. 8 years of my life, most of them ordinary and genuinely good, and one apartment at the end of one hallway that I still, to this day, cannot picture in my mind without slowing my thoughts down around it, the way you'd slow your steps walking past a door you already know better than to knock on. I think about Priya, too, more than I let on to anyone who asks. We've spoken a handful of times since she moved out, always briefly, always circling the edges of what happened without either of us quite stepping into the middle of it again. She told me, the last time we talked, that she still sleeps with a light on, some years later, in an apartment on the other side of the city with no shared wall to anything at all. I told her I understood completely, and I meant it more literally than she probably realized. If you spend enough time responsible for an old building, you learn there are places within it that simply feel wrong before you have any reason to say why. A stillness that isn't peaceful, a silence with an edge you can feel yourself cross the moment you step through a doorway. Most of the time, that feeling is exactly what it seems like, pattern recognition doing what it's supposed to do, nothing more. I used to believe that completely, without exception. I still mostly do, in every building I've worked in since, except the Aldermere Arms, where a door that was never supposed to be opened again is now a stretch of blank hallway wall, and where, as far as I know, every new superintendent hired since still gets told, on their very first day, the same 2 words I was told on mine.